Good morning and welcome to the Belong Collective. My name is Justin Douglas. Nice to meet you. I'm the lead pastor here. And just want to quickly say a word about, yesterday was Hershey Pride. And we've been an organizing sponsor for Hershey Pride since it began 3 years ago. And I just want to share a minute about kind of what that means. Myself and a few others, Melinda, Rachel, the year that COVID stopped Central PA Pride, they weren't able to do it because that Pride takes so long to plan out. It's months and months and months in advance. So they got to make that call. And then the numbers got better in that summer, and that was 3 years ago now. And we said, well, let's plan something. And in I think 2.5, 3 weeks, we put together the first Hershey Pride, and that was completely funded and done by the Belong Collective in the sense of what took place there. And last year was similar, but it grew exponentially. And then this year we had our first year with sponsors, and it grew even more. And I just want to say, I think one of the cool things about this community is that we do a lot of very grassrootsy stuff, and it's cool to see some of the seeds that we throw, and sometimes we throw them and they're like, oh, that sprouted a little bit, and then it was done. It was a good thing. And then sometimes it's it sprouts and it sprouts and it sprouts, and now it's really rooted, and it's really cool to see that had it not been for this community, that would not exist. And I'm not trying to center us on Hershey Pride, but I'm just trying to say, I think for many of you who have wanted to be part of a church that's doing work in the world that looks more like maybe what Jesus would be doing, or really spreading love, spreading hope to people, spreading healing to people, I think that's an opportunity for us to give ourselves a pat on the back and say, we stepped up to an opportunity that was there, and we kept seeing it through. And year 4 is looking like it's going to be better than ever. We definitely had over 1,000 people through yesterday. It's hard to tell entirely because with Javapalooza next door, they kind of come in and out. But based on just what we can know, we were in a good place yesterday. So. Part of what I would like to talk about is a little bit about, for today, coming out of Pride yesterday, I wanted to talk about my journey a little bit to what I'll call affirming theology. Affirming theology is the belief that, we could write a whole page on this, but I guess I'll distill it to affirming theology is that I believe that someone who is LGBT is not hated by God, but loved by God, is not put away by God, but instead accepted by God, that their sexual orientation does not prohibit them from the gospel or the kingdom. And so I want to talk a little bit about that today, but I've done in this community in the past, and you can probably find it online somewhere, a very theological way through scriptures and stuff like that, and I love those conversations. We will have a little bit of that. But I want to make today a little more experiential personally, because I think one of the things that I always like to remember is that the Bible isn't just happening in its own place. When people tell me the Bible says it, so it's true, I always say, well, your interpretation of the Bible? And then they're like, no, it's not my interpretation of the Bible, it's what the Bible says. But I'm like, you're also a white Western American, and that context can't be taken away for how you're reading it, because the first readers read it differently, and people in Africa are reading it differently, and people in Asia. Now, there are 100% overarching principles, but when we look at one particular verse and we say this only means this, and this is the only way of understanding it, and there's no other way of understanding it, we probably need to take a minute to take a breath and own our own bias when we come to the text, or our own upbringing. And so I think sometimes taking the time, like I'm going to today, to go through a little bit of narrativization of my story and how it comes to, is narrativization even a word? I just made that up. To affirming theology. I'm a little bit burnt from yesterday, not like physically from the sun, but it was a long day, so I'm gonna do my best. But why I'm affirming. So my background a little bit, I'm gonna show you some pictures and I'll explain them. So we'll go to this first picture, these two pictures here. So I grew up most of my childhood on a sheep farm, so you can see some sheep over there. And I also grew up, this is the quintessential stock photo for being homeschooled right here. This is about perfect. Except it's absolutely astonishing she's not wearing a head covering. That's really problematic for me. No, I'm just kidding. If you know much about homeschooling, there's all kinds of memes I could show you that pretty much would be my experience of being homeschooled. Is anybody watching the Duggars thing right now? Shiny Happy People. Is anybody watching that or has already watched that? Anyway, it's a documentary about the Duggars, and they do homeschool. So it was very funny because I only watched one episode so far, so I haven't got all the way into it. But in the one episode, they referenced a homeschool curriculum that they use that's like incredibly hyper conservative and crazy. And I'm like, we definitely used that same curriculum in certain parts of my education growing up. So I just say that to say what I'm trying to express here is that growing up in Indiana on a sheep farm, in central Indiana on a sheep farm, being homeschooled through high school, all the way through high school, I have a certain context for the world. I grew up to even broaden this out beyond just LGBT inclusion. I grew up, and the first time I heard the N-word was my grandpa. So I think understanding the context I'm coming from is a particularly conservative. I want to hesitate to put too many labels on it because I think that can be very, very difficult as well. Because I also want to express that I think I am the hard worker I am today because I grew up on a sheep farm. I think I learned so many principles about order, work, planning, preparation that have served me so well in my life. And I think, one of the cool things about being homeschooled is that most of y'all go to school as kids and you spend about 7 hours at school and about 2 hours learning. And so I would do 2 hours of learning and then play guitar the rest of the day. It was fabulous. And I love guitar and I love music. And so much of my passion and joy and love for music was able to be expressed because I was homeschooled that probably wouldn't have had the opportunity to be expressed as much. So in every one of these spaces that I can see maybe ingrained in me some things I've had to unlearn, there's also been a lot of things that I've benefited from. And so I think sometimes what we love to do when we cross a bridge of a new chapter in our story is we love to burn the last chapter instead of honor what was good and learn from what maybe isn't helpful in our story any longer. But I share this because this is the context I had when I went to college. And I went to college, you can go to the next slide, at a university called Liberty University, which has its own amount of documentaries about it. So it's funny that you laugh because you probably have seen those ones. I've done all but burn my degrees publicly from that university. I struggle there as well because I have so many friends from Liberty that are great friends and so many experiences that are really good experiences that I even had on that campus. But if I were to go back on that campus today, it'd be very challenging just because of, context for Liberty. I get there and my roommate is very different. I have two roommates and one of them's incredibly different and just had not really, we didn't really connect, but by the end of the semester we were friends, and about 10 years after we were dorm mates, he messaged me and came out to me publicly. I had my suspicions. And I think about how hard it must have been to be on Liberty's campus and be gay, and just that reality. And I knew other people who were gay at LU as well, who had to be very quiet about that, and I kind of got to experience that a little bit. Probably the very first softening I had to LGBT issues was that me and my friends would call each other a particular slur when we were growing up in high school. And my youth pastor pulled me aside and said, you really should stop using that. And we were just like, we're just joking. You know what I mean? It's no big deal. And he's like, it's actually a really big deal because it's making this space not welcoming and accepting to people who are in the LGBT community. And And I was like, we don't have any people here in the LGBT community. That was like 16, 17-year-old Justin's naive reality. When I'm currently friends with people from my youth group that are gay. So I just didn't know. And I think a lot of this can be chalked up to ignorance. There's a lot of things we just don't know along the way, and we're learning. And so I even think back to my LU time of like the things I didn't know and the things I might have said and the ways I might have made people feel. It's something that definitely sticks with me, and I'm reminded of, just the journey, that the arc of my journey has not been super smooth, or haven't been always been. People just assume sometimes that I've always been affirming, and I'm like, no, I haven't. You're not affirming at Liberty, at least you're not publicly affirming at Liberty, because it's not going to go well for you. And while I was at Liberty, after my first year there, I took a job as a youth pastor at a Southern Baptist church of all places. So, the Southern Baptist Convention, doing amazing things still to today, If you haven't read, they're in the news for, because God forbid a woman preaches, So I was part of a small Southern Baptist church, and many of you have heard me tell some stories about that and had some great experiences there, but also some of that same kind of theological rigidity of just fundamentalism was part of that too. So, all right, next slide. From there, graduated, went to, had to stop as a pastor, and then I went to Massachusetts, went to Boston, specifically Dorchester. You gotta say it like that if you're gonna say Dorchester. So in Dorchester, I didn't really have any, what I would call like expansive, like eye-opening moments around LGBT issues, but I lived in a community that was, I believe, 97% Dominican American or African American. And if you've never been the minority in a community you live in, I highly recommend it. It will very much change your perception of your reality, especially if you grew up on a sheep farm and you were homeschooled. And so part of what, I had been taught around issues of race, a lot of tropes that were just completely inaccurate. Oh, they're lazy. Oh, it's so easy for them to get in college because of this, that, and the other thing. And, the government just hands them money to go to college and this and that and all this. And then to be working with people and realizing, whoa, you have a better SAT score than me, and it was way easier for me to get in college than you. And you have better grades than, like, all these realities that the system was not working for these individuals, and part of my job was a community organizer in that space, and being, becoming painfully aware of the ceilings that existed for people that I could not critically understand the difference between me and them other than color. Like, they were qualified, maybe even more qualified than me, and hitting ceilings that I had never even approached. And so seeing the racial impact, the socioeconomic impact of communities on display there definitely had an impact on me having to unlearn a lot of my bias and racism and just the reality of so much that I was handed. I certainly would say I was one of those people who knew my grandpa was wrong when he said that word, but I was also one of those people who was like, oh, but it's not that bad. And being exposed to it being bad was challenging, because it was the first time I was like, whoa, this is not computing with what I believe. And if you've ever had those moments, it can be really challenging. And I think when we're on that kind of loose footing of like entering into a space where like, I believe this, but I don't know if what I'm witnessing right now is good for what I currently believe. It's really, I guess, destabilizing what I currently believe. We almost have two choices in that. We can run to the thing that is like, that has given us so much comfort, the certainty, and just ignore the things that are destabilizing, right? And just like say, oh, I did not see that. I'm not going to allow that to even be part of my framework. We can say things like the Bible is the Bible, and that's just the way it is. Or we can say, whatever we want in that regard. Or we can try to find comfort even in the destabilization of things. As things are unstable, how do we begin to consider like, what might God be teaching me in this moment? I'm not saying I was that wise at, I think, 24 in Massachusetts, but I was trying my best to learn what God had to teach me in that moment. Then we went to Wisconsin, and I was a youth pastor in Wisconsin. I was there for 8 years. While I was there was a student who came to our youth group who, I just remember vividly sitting in my office at youth group during the small group time, and two of his friends brought him into my office, and they all kind of skipped small groups to come talk to me, and wanted to share a little bit about this individual and how they had been experiencing a lot of bullying at school. So where I lived in Wisconsin was pretty small, and the school that this individual went to, it's like the type of school where all the high schoolers pull up in their trucks with like Confederate flags hanging off the back, even though we're as far north as we can possibly get. It's just that kind of environment. So to be a gay person in that school is incredibly challenging, and it often doesn't go well for you. And so he had been experiencing some of that bullying, and wanted to know if our youth group was a safe space for him. And we committed to our youth group being a safe space for him. And at this time, I was not an affirming pastor, but I believed that we should create space for anyone and everyone to come to youth group. And so we started considering policies and notifying our youth leaders, especially his particular small group leader, he was a freshman at the time, for how to, make sure that we just keep an extra eye out if there's any, thing happening there. And so I just remember, we navigated with this student for 4 years. Graduation was always fun. We would take trash bags and we would poke holes in them and put them on like gowns on the seniors, walk them across the stage, and all their small group leaders would shake their hands. And the freshmen would make them poster board hats that would look like graduation hats. And so it was always this fun rite of passage. And you would always have your small group leader would always say something like publicly about you. And I just remember his small group leader saying that he taught him more than this student taught him more than he ever taught him. And I think journeying with, a gay student for 4 years, because our leaders would graduate with their students up until they were seniors, it was a powerful moment for our youth group, and witnessing that and seeing that we could be this safe space, not necessarily inclusive space, I want to be clear. Our theology was not there, but in a church that wasn't inclusive, we were doing our best to champion that and learning from each step. And then we come to Pennsylvania, and I was asked in my interview for the bridge. I would say somewhere around 50% of my interview when I was coming to be pastor was about LGBT issues. And I was 100% honest. I said, I don't know, to about every question. I certainly did not say I wasn't affirming, but I also didn't say I was. I said, I'm still in process on this, and I believe there's still a lot left to process. And I think that was intriguing to the board at the Bridge, who had already been dealing with issues of inclusion and dealing with some people who had left due to feeling not included. And through that time, and meeting many of the LGBT people who were already at the Bridge before I ever arrived, I continued to have more experiences. And then, once you say everyone belongs, that frustrates people sometimes who think certain people don't belong. And so as we got more vocal about everyone belonging, it became, well, yeah, but what does that really mean? And it's like, well, it just means what it means. And that created some friction with some more conservative churches in the denomination. And as that friction, continued to grow, letters were written anonymously to people and to important people. And then important people decided to give it even more of a scope and importance. And before long, we're a few years down the road, and you know what's a really cool word that I don't use that much? I was defrocked, right? It's very medieval practice to say that I was fired. I had my license removed as a pastor in that denomination, and then the Belong Collective came out of those ashes in 2019, and we've been an affirming church boldly and proudly ever since. And I'm still in process and still learning, because I think the idea that you just become affirming and now you know everything because you're on a particular side or understanding, that's not the way this works. It's definitely something that I'm still very much in process for. I share this because my guess would be you're on your own journey of sorts. You have your own lived experience, and you are probably doing some of the work to look back at all the things that have influenced your belief system. But I think sometimes we don't take the time to look back and be like, you know what? Yeah, that catechism I barely remember that I spent 12 weeks doing or whatever, like, that had a lot more impact on the way I see God than really probably anything else. Maybe I need to go back and reconsider whether or not that is the way that I view God. Maybe I need to dismantle some of that and rebuild something else. My entire journey of faith has been dismantling, rebuilding, dismantling, rebuilding, dismantling, rebuilding. And I would say, I think a flourishing faith looks like that. Because as we get to know the mystery of God a little more, as we get just a little nugget more, we begin to reframe how we understand God, what we think of God, how we're in a relationship with God. And so I share my background to encourage you to maybe even take some time to explore your background. Now, yesterday we had someone show up and protest our event, and that individual wanted to tell me about the Bible, and I didn't have time to tell him about the Bible, but if I did, I might say something like the following. So let's go on a little journey. Sodom and Gomorrah. You've probably heard of these places and this particular passage. Some people might say things like, this person said, this is, you can go to the next slide. This is Albert Mohler, very, very prominent theologian. He says the Genesis passage is very clear, underlined because he's saying it's very clear, that the sin of Sodom that brought on the destruction of the city was indeed linked to homosexuality. So it's very clear. It's so clear. The Bible said it in Genesis, it's clear. The problem is, the Bible says something else in a different place. And so which is it? Because if we go to this passage, this is Ezekiel 16:49, it says, now this was the sin of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters were arrogant, overfed, and unconcerned. They did not help the poor and needy. Some of what we don't know about the understanding of Sodom and Gomorrah is that when we see the violence that occurs, the sexual violence that occurs in that story, if you go back and read it, it's very graphic, and we're not going to read it today. But if you wanted to go back and read that story, what you have to understand is that there was a purpose for that. If someone intruded into your land, you could just kill them. Or you could shame them in a violent way and then send them out, and they would tell everyone, don't go to Sodom and Gomorrah. Sodom and Gomorrah were some of the wealthiest places. They did not want other people to come to them. They're in the desert. When you go from one city to the next, to the next, to the next, the expectation is that you would get shelter in that space. That's the ancient custom. That's the way in which you allow visitors into your city. Sodom and Gomorrah were very much not open to visitors. They wanted to hoard their wealth. They did not want to help people. And when people came that were visitors, that were not welcome, they would do their best to shame them in this way. So I ask you, as you look at the Sodom and Gomorrah story, not only is it clearly stated in the scripture that the sin is a lack of care for the poor, for those in need, being arrogant, being overfed, and being unconcerned. But also, as we think about this story, is it referencing a loving same-sex relationship? No, it's not at all. It's referencing honestly kind of almost a tactic of war in the ancient world, which, by the way, Sodom and Gomorrah weren't the only people doing. So like, I think it's important that we recognize contextually what's happening in that space. All right, now on to, everyone's favorites, the Leviticus passages. I'll read you these passages. You shall not lie with a male as with a woman, it is an abomination. I want to emphasize here, if you go to the next slide, what the word abomination is. It's toebe, and it occurs 117 times in the Old Testament. So 117 times abomination shows up. So just if you're here and you're in the LGBT community, or you have friends in the LGBT community, family in the LGBT community, and someone ever calls them abomination, I would say you would be on theological footing to look right at the back of the individual and call them an abomination. Now, I'm not saying theological footing giving Jesus, but in the way in which they're interpreting Leviticus, it's very unlikely that they have not done something that is an abomination. Meaning eating shellfish, meaning wearing a certain clothes that are woven together of two different types of fabric. Like, we're talking, the list of abominations goes on and on and on and on and on in Leviticus. And it's important to note that in this time, any same-sex relationship was attached to pagan worship. So that was the emphasis here. Again, not loving same-sex relationships, but pagan worship. So the authors are calling out pagan worship. And so the ethical standards for Leviticus, if we want to live up to the ethical standards of Leviticus, then let's do it. Let's have all the ethical standards of Leviticus. And it's going to make a very different society than we have, but it's also going to mean that anytime an alien comes to our border, we let them in. Because Leviticus is very clear on that. So we can go on and on with the ways in which we don't order our society around Leviticus, nor should we, because God has moved us past that. But even the parts of Leviticus that are reoccurring, the same people often who tout this are picking and choosing certain parts. I also think it's important, the Hebrews writer in Hebrews 8:13 says, by calling this covenant, meaning the new covenant of Jesus, new, he has made the first one obsolete. It's outdated and it'll soon disappear. And I think this idea of the covenant of the Old Testament, if we rely too much on that, we can easily miss Jesus. I would say Leviticus is part of the obsolete. That doesn't mean it doesn't have anything to teach us, but it is not for us today. Now I'm going to say something else. I want to go to this passage because a lot of people will quote this passage in Leviticus 20:13, and this has been a passage that has done a lot of harm to the LGBT community. So I want to make it very clear. This could be triggering for some people. If a man lies with a male as with a woman, both of them should have committed an abomination. They should be put to death. Their blood is upon them. So when the author here says put to death, I think the context of pagan worship is very important. This is not about the act as much as it is about the worship not being to God. Now, that's not me defending the passage, but what I want to say is we have historical context for here that also says if your child disobeys you, they can be stoned. In this same area of the Bible. And Jen just got really excited. She's like, whoa, I'm just kidding. I saw your face. No, I'm just playing. But I say this just to say, I've yet to see someone show up to a kids event saying if your kid disobeys you, you should stone them. But I've seen a lot of people show up to prides saying that LGBT people should be put to death. And I'm not asking for them to be consistent. I would much prefer them to be literate in their understanding of the Bible, but they're not consistent even in their illiteracy. So that's really important to me. And again, at this time, we don't have this understanding of loving same-sex relationships, but instead it's pagan worship. And you can go to the New Testament and even see this. For example, when Paul says women should not enter the church with braided hair, with jewelry, their head should be covered, part of this, first of all, some of us have had this used even maybe against, especially women in the room, being told they have to look up a certain way, don't wear jewelry, there's all these other rules that you might have before you can go into a church. what's actually being said there is those are identifiers of pagan worship at that time in that culture, and as they're coming into the church, they're still identifying with the pagan culture. Those aren't today. And I think we have to understand what is timeless and what is in that moment being talked about. For example, let's talk about this. The intersection of artificial intelligence and the gospel. Does Paul have anything to say about that? No! Because Paul wasn't around during the intersection of the gospel and artificial intelligence. But it's coming, and it's going to create spiritual conversations. Hey, what about alien life form? Does Paul have anything to say about alien life form and the gospel and what it means to follow Jesus? No, but we could have alien life form. If that happened, that would create a whole new conversation. What I guess I'm saying is, where we are culturally is not where Paul was culturally. That doesn't mean his words don't have great influence on the way we should consider things, but to say that we are dealing with a temple down the road that is a temple of prostitution, and now we've had 100 people from that temple join our church, and it's changing the complete makeup of our church, and we say, okay, so there's some things we're going to do a little differently here with y'all, because there's just a lot of practices that you need to unlearn that have not been helpful for you, and you're interested in being here, and so let's talk about how we can help you follow Jesus. That's what Paul's doing. And I think it's important that we recognize that even as we look at passages like Leviticus. All right, I'm going to fly through this one because we just don't have a whole lot of time left. This is the one that had me hung up the longest. If you're wondering what passage kept me in I don't know mode the longest, it was this one. And this is Paul's writing in Romans 1, 26 through 27. For this reason, God gave them up to dishonorable passions, for their women exchanged natural relations for those that are contrary to natural, and the men likewise gave up natural relations with women and were consumed with passion for one another when committing shameless acts with men and receiving in themselves the due penalty for their sin. Now, a few things here. There are 4 passages in the New Testament very similar to this, most of them by Paul. So I want to talk about this Romans passage though, because I do think if I was to be having a conversation with someone who is not affirming, and this was their passage that they really were at a roadblock with, I actually would probably say, I understand. I understand you. I think this passage is the hardest hurdle to get over, because all the other passages you can really argue, critical context is just obvious of what's happening in those spaces. And here, I think it's obvious too. I just think it takes a few more degrees to get to that. So a few things that have me not taking Paul's words the way in which maybe you grew up taking them, or the church at large probably holds this passage. Why does Paul take the very first chapter of his book to address this? This is an introduction. This is not he's not deep into his soliloquy toward Rome. He is he's at the very beginning, and he decides at the very beginning to talk about this. And I think it's important because as we think about Paul, he's writing to a culture, a context that has either encouraged him, frustrated him, things that he wants to call out. What's happening in Rome at this time, which is you can Google it later, it's called pederasty, and I'm not going to get into what that means, but ultimately it just means older men dominating younger boys. None of us, even 2,000 years later, would argue that this is a good thing, okay? But Rome was, it was happening in Rome all over. And it wasn't in any way a loving monogamous relationship. These are people who are older men who are often married to women, but this was a way of dominance throughout the culture. The likelihood that Paul is calling that out and pagan worship is far more likely, in my mind, than him calling out loving monogamous same-sex relationships. Yet, we don't have a lot of historical context for this time of loving monogamous same-sex relationships, or at least that Paul would have had the intersection with. So he's not having to deal with that. That's not how he sees sexuality. That's really important, because if Paul were in our culture, he might call out a lot of perversion within our culture, but he might also not call out a loving relationship. I don't know that though, and I want to be clear. I don't know what Paul's intent was. I don't know if Paul would have seen any of that as perverse, and I would say as many degrees as I've moved from the sheep farm to today, Paul would have to move about 10,000 more to get to where I am today, because his context is so different. So I'm not going to put words in Paul's mouth. That's certainly not what I'm going to do. But I do want to emphasize two more things. First, some research. And I'm going to really fly through this fast, so I will have these slides posted if anybody wants these. I'll have it like in a PDF form. But the research says this. There was a Marin Foundation survey done. This is the largest ever scientific survey on religious history, practices, and beliefs of the LGBT community. This was actually done in 2016, so I would guess the data points have even moved further in different directions, but it's still, I think, good for us today. We're going to skip to, these are, you can go to the next slide. It's just a quote. It's a book, Us versus Us, a book I would highly encourage you to check out. But the research sample is more geographically generalizable than any other, excluding the census gathering. So they were very, very broad in this study, okay? These are the people who did the study, 2 conservative evangelicals and 1 atheist from Northwestern. So they wanted to make it clear that there's no bias within the study for the findings. So let's go to the statistical findings, and I want to go really quick. There is no they, there is only us. 86% of the LGBT community, there we go, the LGBTQIA community were raised in a faith community from ages 0 to 18. That's 75% of the American general population. So there are more people that were raised in the faith community that identify as LGBT than in general population. So the church is making people gay. No, I'm just kidding. I don't know. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying this is important for us to know, right? I hope I can make that joke. We're recording this. I might not post it. No. Let's go to the next slide. So this is really important in consideration to this, the Great Exodus. 54% of LGBTQIA plus people leave their religious community after the age of 18, whereas only 27% of the general American population does. They're leaving at higher rates. All right, why do they leave? Well, they asked that question. So let's see what the top 3 reasons LGBTQIA people leave. Negative personal experience, theological considerations, institutional misgivings. The reason the general population leaves, gradually just drifted away, stopped believing religion's teachings, unhappy with religion's teachings. You can see they're 2 very different experiences. If you identify as queer and you're in the church, you're gonna have a very different experience than just the random person that drifts away. All right, next. So the new prodigals, this is really important. 76% of LGBTQIA plus people are open to returning to their religious community and its practices. I want to emphasize this. These are people who have been so burned by the church that they've been told they're going to hell, and they still feel a sense of longing toward the church, towards spirituality in some capacity. Now, this is a 2016 study. Who knows what the last few years have done? I'm just going to be honest. That number's probably down. But at the same time, the fact that the general population is at 9%. The gap there is wild. That's actually one of the craziest things within this study. And what would influence their return, you might ask? What would influence their return? Well, they asked that question, so let's see what would influence their return. Feeling loved. Feeling loved. Being patient. A church that's patient. By the way, it's not until 3 that any theologies had to change. Love and patience is the first answer. Change of theology. Do not attempt to change my orientation, authenticity, and being supportive. Shocker, right? Let's look at the Bible again. This is what Jesus says. Hearing that Jesus had silenced Sadducees, the Pharisees got together, one of them an expert in the law, testing him, saying, "Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law?" Jesus replied, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. This is the first and greatest command, and the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these 2 commands." Jesus later says this, "A new command I give you, love one another as I have loved you, so you must love one another. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples, if you love one another." 1 Peter 4:8 says this, "Above all, love each other deeply, because love covers over a multitude of sins." I want to emphasize, above all your theology, above all your opinions, above you being uncomfortable, above your judgments, above your background and experiences, above your fears, above your preferences, above it all. What are we called to do as Christ followers? We are called to love. We are called to love. I just want to read this. This is long, but I think this embodies the Belong Collective, and it embodies, I think, our response, even if we're struggling with what it means to be an affirming Christian, or someone who affirms the LGBT community. We are called to lead with love. God is love. Love is the center of everything. How do we know what love is? We look to Jesus, the perfect embodiment of love. Jesus is the exact representation of God. In Jesus, we see how to be human and how to embody love. So we look to Jesus first and foremost. All of humanity has an innate need to be known, loved, and included. For us, belonging represents our commitment to know, love, and include others as Jesus did. This is what inclusion looks like to me. It's less about me throwing a scripture verse at you and proving you wrong, and it's more about me emphasizing that God is love, love is real, and I am called to emulate that love in this world. As he starts playing guitar, I want to share this last thing with you. It's going to be funny when you see it. A NASCAR-themed living room wedding. Let's talk about this. A couple months ago, I was asked to perform a wedding for two women who could not find a church to marry them. And it ended up being a living room wedding. And I showed up to this house in the middle of the day, and it was just them and some family members. And I walked in this house, and it was like a flashback to Indiana in some ways. It's kind of funny to think about this, just because I think of my family members and like many of them and how they might have little trinkets on the wall that are like NASCAR or other things. And I walk in, and it's, Dale Earnhardt, memorabilia all through the living room. And I'm like, so where are we doing this? Oh, we're doing it right here. This is awesome. This is like the collision of Indiana and me being affirming all in one place. And I'm doing a wedding for these two women that I just met, and I'm blessing them because no other pastor would. No other pastor would. And we had a great little service there with them and their family. And I just want to say, I think when we open ourselves up to love, we might find ourselves in the weirdest situations we've ever thought. I never thought I was going to lose my license. I never thought we were going to go it on our own. I never thought I was going to end up in a living room, NASCAR-themed living room, doing a wedding for a lesbian couple. Like, I just never thought that was going to happen. I would have loved to see someone tell me that was going to happen in my future, like way back when. But I share this to say, I think when we open ourselves up to love, we become an instrument for God to use that puts us in places where we are around people that need love, that need to experience that. God is at work moving those people into our orbits. And I've seen that in my own story, and I hope you see that as well. So let me pray for us, and I pray that we would all commit ourselves to loving better, even if our theology is still being worked out. Good and gracious God, thank you for the ways you don't leave us where we are, that you constantly are drawing us more into your presence, more into your love, that we're experiencing your love, and that we're growing in the ways in which we emulate it as well. God, I pray you would give us, each and every one of us here, an openness and a humility. God, if there's one thing you can give us, it's the ability to be humble, to not act like we have all the answers. And from that place to be open to hearing from other people, to trying to understand other people's situations, and ultimately to leading with love in everything. God, may we be people who emulate the love of Jesus in this world.